Morning sunlight spilled across the polished marble floors, catching on every reflective surface of the high-rise lobby like 1,000 judgmental eyes. The building hummed with quiet power, the kind that only money and ambition could conjure. Calvin moved through it like a shadow, pushing his mop in steady, dignified circles, invisible yet essential. When Richard Hale's voice cut through the air, smooth, rehearsed, and cruel, it froze everyone mid-step. "Careful there, Calvin," he smirked, gesturing toward the wet floor. "We wouldn't want you to slip and sue the company for your next big payday." Laughter erupted from the suits around him, sharp and hollow. Calvin said nothing. His hands didn't tremble, though the sting of humiliation coursed through him like current. He looked up, just once, and the silence that followed his gaze wasn't anger, but something deeper. It was the calm before truth rearranged the air itself. After the crowd dispersed, the building returned to its sterile hum. Calvin moved through the halls as though nothing had happened, yet something in the air had shifted. The laughter still lingered, faint and bitter, but his silence had turned it hollow. People avoided his eyes now, pretending to be busy. In his solitude, Calvin felt the weight of a familiar history pressing against his chest, the centuries-old story of pride mistaken for worth. He had seen this before, worn it like armor, and though the sting burned deep, he chose not to carry it in anger but in patience, as if time itself were on his side. In the staff lounge, whispers replaced laughter. No one said Richard's name, but everyone replayed the scene in their minds, each person silently negotiating their own guilt. Ella sat apart, stirring her coffee without drinking. The spoon clinked against porcelain like a heartbeat in an empty room. She had seen arrogance before, but never so publicly dressed as power. Something about Calvin's restraint unsettled her, the kind of strength that couldn't be humiliated. It was dignity in its purest form, and it left everyone else feeling smaller. Upstairs in the executive boardroom, Richard laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. The echo of his earlier mockery followed him like a scent he couldn't wash off. He flipped through reports, gave orders, signed papers. Yet every time he looked out the glass walls toward the city, his reflection seemed smaller. He told himself it was nothing, that the janitor was just another man with a mop. But somewhere deep in the silence between his own thoughts, something began to whisper. What if that man wasn't who you thought he was? That night, as the office emptied, Calvin remained. The floors gleamed, his work immaculate, as always. But this time he paused at the foot of the lobby staircase and looked up toward the top floor, where the CEO's office light still burned. He didn't need revenge or witnesses. What he carried was something stronger, truth, biding its time. The city outside shimmered in the dark glass, 1,000 stories reflected in silence. Calvin's reflection stood among them, calm, steady, and waiting for the right moment to be seen. By morning, the building's rhythm had changed. People greeted Calvin differently now. Too soft, too careful, as if their politeness could erase what they had witnessed. He felt their discomfort hanging in the air, yet he carried himself unchanged, his every step a quiet statement that dignity cannot be stolen by laughter. In the cafeteria, conversations broke mid-sentence when he entered. Richard's joke had rippled far beyond the lobby, reaching corners of conscience no one wanted to admit existed. Ella watched it all. The guilt, the avoidance, the silence. The real stain wasn't on the marble floor anymore. It was on their humanity. Upstairs, the executives spoke in half-whispers. Richard Hale moved through the office, his voice clipped and impatient, but his confidence seemed thinner now. Rumors had started about the cruelty, about the man had mocked. Calvin's silence had become a mirror, forcing others to see themselves. Richard pretended not to notice, yet every reflection he passed, a glass wall, a steel panel, a black screen, seemed to stare back, accusingly. He told himself he didn't care, but his jaw stayed tight, and his smile came too late to fool anyone. In a quiet corner office, Ella scrolled through her inbox, her thoughts elsewhere. She replayed the moment, the CEO's words, the janitor's silence, the shift in the room when pride met dignity and lost. It had unsettled something in her. She found herself curious about Calvin's past, wondering what kind of man could stand in humiliation and still radiate peace. She opened a new browser tab, typing his name slowly. The search results revealed nothing, just shadows and fragments. But the absence itself felt like a clue. Down in the storage room, Calvin worked alone. He liked the silence. It was honest, unlike the forced chatter upstairs. The rhythm of his broom against the concrete floor steadied his thoughts. He didn't need anyone's apology. Truth had its own patience. As he swept, his eyes paused on a forgotten shelf stacked with old company binders. Yellowed papers marked with the logo of a firm he once knew too well. His hand hovered over them. Time slowed, memory stirring like dust in sunlight. That afternoon, Richard caught his reflection again, this time in the elevator doors as they closed. For a brief second he saw not himself, but Calvin's steady gaze staring back. Something in that look had unsettled him deeply. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound died before it reached his throat. For the first time in years, he felt small inside the glass palace he'd built. Downstairs, the janitor's broom continued its quiet rhythm, unseen, unbothered, unstoppable. The next morning came wrapped in quiet tension. Ella couldn't let it go. The man, the silence, the way everyone else tried to forget. She searched again, this time digging deeper. There were faint traces, an old engineering patent, a design firm's roster from 25 years ago, and a photo, blurred but unmistakable. Calvin Moore listed as a lead designer on a prototype that looked eerily familiar. Ella's pulse quickened as she scrolled. That same blueprint, now refined and rebranded, was framed on Richard Hale's office wall, celebrated as his company's first success. She leaned back, realization settling like a weight in her chest. The janitor wasn't invisible. He had simply been erased. Ella walked the hallway with a strange new clarity, the kind that comes only when truth begins to surface. She passed Calvin near the supply closet, his sleeves rolled up, quietly polishing a brass railing. Their eyes met, briefly, but in that glance she saw something deeper than humility. It was knowing. It was strength worn down to stillness. She wanted to ask, to tell him what she'd found, but she stopped herself. Timing mattered. For now, she just nodded in quiet respect, and he returned it with a faint smile that said more than words could carry. Later that afternoon, Ella stood outside Richard's office door, staring at the framed patent on the wall through the glass. The sleek design, a circuit structure, was identical to the one she'd found in Calvin's archived records. She felt a chill run through her. Richard's voice carried faintly from inside, boasting to a client about innovation, legacy, leadership. Every word scraped against her conscience. She took a photo quietly with her phone, her hands trembling, not out of fear, but out of moral urgency. The truth was no longer just hidden. It was stolen, framed, and celebrated. When evening settled, Ella approached Calvin in the empty lobby. She hesitated before speaking, but truth pressed forward. She told him what she found. The records, the design, the stolen credit. Calvin listened in silence, his eyes fixed on the glimmering floor. When she finished, he simply nodded once. "I know," he said softly. The words carrying no bitterness, only gravity. His voice was calm, but his restraint felt monumental. He didn't need revenge. He needed acknowledgement. For the first time, Ella understood the full weight of grace. That night, Calvin returned home to his small apartment overlooking the city. He sat by the window, the faint buzz of neon signs flickering across his face. He opened an old leather folder from the top of his closet. Inside were blueprints, dated letters, and photographs from another life. He traced a finger along the faded ink of his signature, the one that once stood beside Richard Hale's. For a long while, he just stared. Then he smiled faintly. Not out of satisfaction, but peace. The truth was awake now, and this time, it had witnesses. By morning, Ella's heart carried a storm. She had printed everything: patent records, dates, photographs, signatures, and arranged them neatly in a folder that felt heavier than truth itself. The elevator ride to the top floor stretched like an eternity. Each floor she passed brought her closer to a collision between power and conscience. When she stepped into Richard Hale's office, he looked up with his usual polished indifference, but his eyes flickered when she placed the folder on his desk. She said nothing at first. She didn't need to. The silence did the work for her. Thick and undeniable. Richard flipped through the documents with forced composure, scanning the pages too quickly to truly read them. His smile tightened. "Old paperwork," he said, dismissively, but the edge in his voice betrayed him. The signatures matched. The design was identical. He closed the folder too abruptly, his hand trembling slightly as it hit the desk. Ella didn't speak. She simply looked at him with the steady patience of someone who had already chosen truth over comfort. For the first time, Richard felt the glass walls closing in, every reflection of himself now carrying a question he could no longer ignore. When she left the office, Ella's heart was pounding, not from fear, but from the quiet explosion of righteousness. Richard sat back in his chair, alone now, staring at the folder she'd left behind. The laughter from 2 days ago felt like it belonged to another man, someone smaller. He rubbed his temples, muttering excuses no one could hear. The truth didn't care. It had already made its way through the cracks of reputation and pride. Downstairs, Calvin continued his silent work, unaware that the man who once mocked him now sat trembling in the tower above. That evening, the storm inside Richard broke through the mask. He stood in front of the framed patent, the same one that now mocked him from the wall. His reflection split down the center of the glass as he touched it, seeing not success but theft. Memories flickered. Calvin's calm voice years ago. The moment had taken credit. The applause that wasn't his to claim. The truth roared silently inside him, and for the first time in years, he felt something close to shame. The applause was gone now, replaced by the echo of his own hollow triumph. Downstairs, Calvin finished mopping the final hallway of the night. He moved slowly, not from fatigue, but from deep thought. The world above him was shifting, though he hadn't seen it yet. Justice, he knew, didn't always arrive in grand gestures. It came quietly, like dawn. He wrung out his mop, packed away his tools, and stood still, listening to the hum of the building. Somewhere above, guilt was learning its first lesson in humility. And Calvin, steady as ever, let peace settle on his shoulders like a well-earned crown. The next morning, the air inside the building felt heavier, like everyone could sense a shift they couldn't yet name. Calvin arrived as always, his uniform pressed, his steps unhurried, but his eyes carried a purpose unseen before. He made his way to the top floor, not with hesitation but quiet resolve. When the elevator doors opened, the chatter around the executive floor fell silent. He pushed his mop aside, carrying instead a worn leather folder, the same one he had once tucked away like a forgotten truth. The silence stretched as he approached Richard's office. Every step was measured. Every second felt earned. Richard didn't speak when Calvin entered. He simply watched as the janitor, this man had mocked, placed the folder gently on his desk. Calvin's voice, when it came, was calm and deliberate. He spoke not of revenge, not even of anger, but of memory. The day they'd met, the project they built, and the handshake that had meant trust. As Richard's eyes moved over the papers, realization rippled through him like a storm breaking glass. It wasn't accusation Calvin offered. It was truth, and it was heavier than any punishment. Calvin's words flowed like a river long dammed. He spoke of the company that had stolen his designs, of the promises made and broken, and of the choice he made afterward to keep his peace, not his pride. Every sentence stripped away another layer of Richard's composure. There was no rage, no raised voice, only a truth so pure it hurt to hear. By the time Calvin finished, Richard's hands trembled on the edge of the desk. He couldn't meet the man's eyes. For the first time, power bowed its head to dignity. When Calvin left the office, no one stopped him. No one dared. The staff that once laughed now stood silent as he passed, their eyes lowered, shame thick in the air. Richard remained behind, motionless, staring at the open folder like a mirror too bright to face. In that stillness, the sound of Calvin's slow footsteps down the hall carried more weight than any speech could. The building, once his fortress, now felt like a confessional. The truth had not destroyed him, it had revealed him. Back in the lobby, Calvin paused by the glass doors, gazing at the reflection of the city outside. The day felt lighter somehow. He wasn't vindicated, he was free. Dignity had outlasted cruelty. Patience had outsown pride. As he stepped out into the sunlight, the sound of his boots against marble echoed like a benediction. Upstairs, Richard sat alone, staring at the patent that was no longer his. The world didn't need to know the details. Truth had already chosen its audience. And in the quiet after the storm, the man once mocked became the measure of every soul left watching. The news spread quietly, without words, without gossip. Only looks. The laughter that once filled those sterile hallways had vanished, replaced by a heavy, reflective silence. Richard moved through the office like a man haunted by his own echo. Every nod, every handshake felt rehearsed, hollow. Meanwhile, Calvin continued his work as if nothing had changed, his calm presence an unspoken reminder of everything that had. Some avoided him out of guilt, others greeted him softly, almost reverent. Power had shifted, not through scandal, but through conscience. The building itself seemed to breathe differently now. Richard shut himself in his office, the weight of silence pressing heavier than the city skyline beyond his windows. The folder still sat open on his desk, papers slightly curled at the edges from being handled too often. He stared at Calvin's name printed beside his own on the old patent record, tracing the signature with trembling fingers. The realization that his empire's foundation wasn't built solely on brilliance, but on betrayal, gnawed at him. For the first time, he saw himself not as a leader, but as a thief dressed in success. Meanwhile, in the lower floors, the staff had begun to change their tone. Conversations turned reflective. Some spoke of Calvin's dignity, others of Richard's downfall. But no one dared to joke anymore. Ella watched it all unfold from her desk, understanding that justice had taken root, not in scandal, but in silence. She knew Calvin would never demand acknowledgement. He didn't need it. His calm had done what words never could. It had forced the entire building to see itself. And that, she realized, was a revolution. Late that evening, Richard found himself wandering down to the maintenance floor. Somewhere he'd never been before. The air was different there, real, carrying the scent of metal and detergent. He stopped when he saw Calvin finishing his rounds, the mop gliding steadily over the tiles. For a long moment, he just watched. When Calvin turned and saw him, their eyes met again, not as boss and janitor, but as two men standing on the same ground at last. Richard opened his mouth, but no excuse would come. The silence between them spoke more truth than any apology could. That night, as Richard left the building, he paused in the lobby. The same place where he'd once humiliated a man for the amusement of others. The space looked unchanged, yet it felt transformed. He gazed at the marble floor where the reflection of Calvin's calm eyes had once stopped him cold. The echoes of that moment still lingered. He realized the cost of arrogance wasn't losing respect. It was never earning it in the first place. When he turned toward the doors, the city lights glimmered like 1,000 quiet witnesses. The man who walked out was not redeemed, but finally aware. A week passed before Richard finally found the courage to face him again. The board had noticed his silence, the staff his sudden humility, but no one dared ask why. Early one morning, before the building stirred awake, Richard stepped into the quiet lobby where Calvin worked. The sound of the mop sliding over marble echoed like memory. For a moment he simply watched. The same man, the same floor, but everything different now. When Calvin looked up, Richard spoke softly, almost breaking. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words trembled in the air like glass about to shatter. Calvin studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Not in forgiveness, but in release. Calvin didn't speak for a long while. He just continued his work, letting the rhythm of the mop fill the silence. When he finally looked up, his voice was steady and warm. "You can't change the past," he said quietly, "but you can stop living in its shadow." The simplicity of it struck harder than any accusation. Richard's eyes glistened, and for the first time, the man who once believed himself powerful looked smaller. Not diminished, but human. Calvin turned back to his work, peace radiating from every movement. His dignity had never been taken, it had been teaching. Later that day, Richard called an all-staff meeting. No announcements, no new product launches, just a confession. His voice trembled as he spoke, telling them the story of a man he once mocked, a man whose ideas had helped build everything around them. He didn't name himself as the thief. He didn't have to. The silence in the room was enough to strip every illusion away. When he finished, there was no applause, only the quiet sound of understanding settling over everyone. Humility had finally found its voice, and it spoke through truth. That evening, Calvin left the building one last time before retirement. He had told no one. It wasn't a gesture of victory, but of closure. As he stepped into the cold evening air, he paused to take in the reflection of the glass tower against the dusk sky. He wasn't leaving behind humiliation or pain. He was leaving behind a lesson. His truth had rippled through walls built on pride and forced them to breathe. Somewhere behind him, lights flickered on one by one. Proof that even glass can remember what it once reflected. Weeks later, a bronze plaque appeared in the lobby near the marble staircase. No one announced it, but everyone noticed. It bore no grand title, just words simple and eternal. Integrity outlives power. Beneath it, a name. Calvin Moore. The staff paused there often, not out of guilt anymore, but respect. And sometimes, when the light hit just right, the reflection of the city shimmered across those engraved letters, like a quiet reminder. Dignity had written its own legacy, not through noise, but through the silence that followed truth.